Good morning, everyone. Apologies for the slight delay from our presenter, but welcome to Mike Watkeys. Just by way of background, Mike was born in Malta in 1952, spent his childhood in Ghana and then Germany, attended boarding school in Oxford in England. He obtained a BSc Honours from the Department of Geology and Oceanography at the University College of Swansea in Wales. After graduating in 1975, he went to work for the Rhodesian Geological Survey before, as he says, stepping across the Limpopo River and completing a PhD in the Department of Geology at the University of the Witwatersrand. He then spent time in the geochemistry department at UCT as a postdoctoral researcher. In 1989, he was appointed onto the academic staff of the geology department at the University of Natal. After various iterations, by the time he retired in 2015, it had metamorphosed into the discipline of geological sciences, University of KwaZulu-Natal. He has a wide range of interests, not just within geology, that are reflected in the diverse topics of his publications. He's also a very colourful person generally. Currently, he continues his research as emeritus professor at UKZN and undertakes structural geology consultancy work related to exploration and mining geology around the world. So we look forward to this presentation today, Mike, and thanks for making yourself available. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, John. I should perhaps open by saying this is a rank bad organization by you guys that would try and watch cricket and listen to me at the same time. A while ago, earlier this year, I had to give a talk to the Mensa Society, and one of those geniuses decided to have my talk actually clash one-on-one with a box All Blacks game. I'm going to be talking about Atlantis, but not the Atlantis up the west coast of the Cape, but Atlantis, the island of Atlas, which is famous in myths and legends, and there may be some facts, or it might actually be some fake Paleonews. You have to have a disclaimer these days because talks get recorded, so I thought I'd better disclaimer get in quickly. Firstly, no Antlians were harmed during collection material for this presentation. It hasn't been vetted by the Flat Earth Society, the Hollow Earth Society, or the SPCA. That's the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Aliens. Funding wasn't provided by Donald Trump or Bill Gates or any pharmaceutical company. The latter is quite important to declare when you're trying to get copyright, that you're not funded by a pharmaceutical company. All reasonable efforts were performed when attempting to obtain copyright approval for any photographs or diagrams used in this. If any publisher wants to dispute this, here's a photograph of me with my name and where I am, and you can contact me there. And finally, with regard to language, nudity, violence, etc. here, there's excessive violence used in the destruction of Atlantis. And for those people of sensitive dispositions, this presentation contains an image of a dead person. So you may wish to close your eyes at that moment. There's a very famous quote from Plato, which leads us on to Atlantis. For the ocean, there was at that time navigable. For in front of the mouth, which you Greeks call, as you say, the Pillars of Heracles, there lay an island which was larger than Libya and Asia together. Of course, exactly what the Pillars of Hercules were or are of interest. Here is a Pillars of Hercules that I found in Greece on one of the Greek islands, but I don't think that is what Plato was talking about. As regards the size of Libya and Asia, in those days, Libya was basically North Africa because they had yet to work out the whole of Africa, and Asia was going as far as India. So therefore, there had to be some continent of that size that had disappeared with Atlantis on it. There have been various attempts at defining Atlantis. This is quite an interesting one from 1940, as the Second World War was progressing, with a map showing, a natural history magazine map showing where Atlantis and another continent was. Presumably they were a little worried about submarines bumping into these things during the war. This is a diagram from millenniumeducation.com. Now that sounds pretty optimistic. They should be able to supply good information. They have Atlantis written across this map, which comes from another paper, which this core here was actually looking at the circulation of the North Atlantic. They don't acknowledge this. It's pretty obvious from this that there's no submerged continent out in the Atlantic Ocean. So one would progress thinking, okay, we're going to get something intelligent out of this. However, the lead-in says the times of Atlantis myth and legend and the Atlantean technology was a time called returning of the gods. Eons ago, brothers from outer space, from the spiritual guidance of the masters of wisdom, creators of the universe, came to Earth. Maybe not. That's not really going to help us. There is a slightly more useful one, perhaps, this website, www.begonia.org. It's a really useful website because it's actually got the address of the embassy of Atlantis on it. Not only that, it actually supplies maps of the people on the islands of Atlantis, and you'll notice that the English and the French are separated on this island quite firmly, with the Portuguese in between. This apparently was 6000 BC or so. It's a minor problem because there were no English or French in those days. But there is a very useful website called Gaia.com, and this is full of useful information on Atlantis. And it is because the presenter, Matthias de Stefano, provides insight from past lives he lived in the Canis Major constellation and in a major colony of Atlantis named Chem. And he started telling people about this at the age of 21. So there's a remarkable wealth of information on this website with these half-hour to 1.5-hour podcasts on various things. The one that immediately caught my eye was Vibratory Languages of Atlantis and the 12 families of Atlantis. There's a whole host of stuff here. We have something called Open Minds, which you probably do need, which is presented by Regina Meredith, although she probably mispronounces that name, that Welsh name, as Meredith. All sorts of useful information here. It's really good background for a talk like this. And then perhaps Beyond Belief does describe some of these presentations, but the one that is very useful to look at and go from here, returning to planet Earth, following Plato to Atlantis. And the reason why that is so important is Plato is the sole source of the Atlantis legend. There was a dialogue which he wrote down between Critias and Socrates. Critias was actually repeating a story that he heard when he was about 10 years old. And that story was told to him by his grandfather about a priest who visited Egypt about 200 years earlier, where the priest was told of a civilization that existed 9,000 years earlier. So this is the whole source of the Atlantis legend. Somebody remembering what their grandfather told them when 10 years old, and the grandfather repeating something about a priest 200 years earlier who went to Egypt, and another priest told him something existed 9,000 years previously. So using these dates today, this civilization would have existed at about 9,500 years BC. So most of the people listening to this talk are geologists. So let's go and think about this. Firstly, we know mapping of the ocean floor. There's no drowned area the size of Libya and Asia in the Atlantic Ocean. There are other areas which are beyond the Pillars of Heracles, places like the Bahamas and Doggerland that have been drowned, continental shelves and rising the seawaters, the last after last glacier maximum. None of them have any evidence of any major civilization being there. And not beyond the Pillars of Heracles, well, there's the Black Sea. The Black Sea was a lake until about 6,200 BC, when the waters flowed over from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. That occurred about the same time, actually, as the tsunami that drowned Doggerland here in the North Sea. And then you've got the Persian Gulf, the drowning of the Persian Gulf. None of them really show any evidence for any major civilization that existed. So let's go back and take a look at what was going on at that time. This is quite a neat map of the last glacier maximum of Europe, about 18,000 years ago. What is most obvious on this is the Black Sea is not linked through to the Mediterranean yet. Caspian Sea is bigger than today, and the Aral Sea is much bigger than today in there. And obviously there's more continental shelf exposed at this time. Sea level was about minus 120 meters at that time. And we have some very nice studies done in ecology, so we can reconstitute what the ecology looked like. This is just prior to 9,500 BC. This line here is an important line. It's described as the approximate limit of cold fauna. Well, for those people in South Africa, the cold fauna is probably on this side, because on that side where there's permafrost, it is what would be technically called by most geologists in South Africa fucking freezing up there. But nevertheless, there were people living there. There were people who were not only living there, the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, but also producing these spectacular paintings. This one at Lascaux. And we have some nice reconstructions of people at that time. Most famous is the Cheddar Man, which is near Bristol in England. He has had a facial reconstruction and his DNA looked at. And quite remarkably, both his DNA and his looks were very much like a history teacher in that area. So there was this thought that actually there's a complete genetic line between Cheddar Man and Adrian Target in the modern day. And that is what the history teacher really looks like. Now there's a little more doubt about that. So we have people living well, the lives well known, 9,500 BC in Europe, and no civilization. So sea level was rising after the last glacier maximum. It was about 80 meters lower than it is today. 9,500 years ago, agriculture was not present in Egypt. So we have no civilization that's known in Egypt at that time. It was the time when the hunter-gatherers in what is now southeast Turkey started having some sort of central areas. Some people call these temples. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous one of them, and beautifully excavated. And the first real town that's known is Çatalhöyük, which is around about 7,500 BC. And this is the first time you're seeing houses and proper civilization in the true word, that people are moving into towns of having organized society. So when did agriculture actually get into Egypt? Well, those people who were living there, some of them went west. Impressed where people went into Europe with taking the Neolithic agriculture with them. They eventually got to the coast of Portugal around about 5,500 years ago. Another group went around the north of the Carpathians through northern Europe, and they got to northwest France around about 5,000 years ago, a little younger. Some important group went off into what is now southern Ukraine and Russia, the Nyamna culture. And those guys actually fed back into Turkey eventually, bringing the Indo-European language with them. The Hittites are one of those groups. But then another group actually went down the Levant coast, and they got into the Nile Delta and the Fayum Depression around about 5,500 years ago. And they brought in agriculture into Egypt at that stage. So this is some 4,000 years after the civilization of Atlantis was supposed to have existed and helped set up the Egyptian civilization. You can also look at the language that people brought in. I mentioned about Indo-European. Well, the languages of the Eastern Mediterranean are Semitic, and we can follow those languages. They are part of the Afro-Asiatic group And we have written records of those from archaic Egyptian, the first hieroglyphs, 3,400 BC. And we can follow the language evolve all the way through. And Arabic is also a Semitic language, but that came in from Arabia around about 641 AD. So the people living in Egypt had a language which is the same as others in the area. It wasn't anything strange being brought in from Atlantis. So I can do a little summary of the evidence for migrations and invasions if people are coming in from Atlantis into these areas. We can get physical evidence of people at specific times and their activities through skeletons, artifacts. We get inherited evidence in people from linguistics and genetics and isotopes. So on one side, we have biological evidence, and the other one, we have cultural evidence. So when we look at the biological evidence, the skeletal structure of ancient Egyptians is indistinguishable from modern. Some people seem to think that the Atlanteans had a strange skeletal structure which should have been passed on into these guys. We can reconstruct people. This is Ramesses, the mummy, and there are two facial reconstructions, one as a young man and one as a middle-aged man to an old man. And the DNA we can get out of these guys and girls, and it closely matches the present population of the Near East. The only difference is these days, there's some sub-Saharan mitochondrial DNA that's which is basically south of the Sahara, coming in after ancient Egypt. We also have artifacts. We've got a well-documented sequence from the African humid period, that's when the Sahara was not a desert, but a well-watered area, through to the dynastic period of the pharaohs. In the north there, I mentioned the agriculture getting into the Nile Delta around about 5,500 BC. Well, further upstream in Upper Egypt, you have the Nagda culture, which is documenting people moving in from the Sahara Desert into the Nile Valley as the Sahara dries up. And then I mentioned, as far as language is concerned, ancient Egypt was an Afro-Asiatic language. It isn't some sort of strange language of the gods. So we can show there's nothing funny going on in Egypt that required people from Atlantis to develop that civilization. So where is this story coming from? And it goes back to geology. In 1869, it was discovered on Santorini, which was called Thera in the Bronze Age, that the civilization there had been destroyed by a volcanic eruption. And there have been some very nice excavations. There's a little town on the southeast, well, the southern part of Santorini has been well excavated, and some beautiful frescoes have been exposed, showing what life was like on Thera during the days of the Minoan civilization. This painting to me does bring to life row, row, row your boat in a manner that I don't think it was written for. One of the interesting things about that Minoan eruption on Thera is there are no bodies. The people actually got off that island before the eruption occurred. And in the about 1930s and 40s, starting with Marinotus, he was the first person in this very seminal paper to suggest that the Minoan civilization actually was wiped out by this volcanic eruption. We'll come back to that later. And then in 1960, Gallinopoulos, he's the first person to propose really that the Santorini, or Thera as it was then, was actually Atlantis. I'm always intrigued by this name Gallinopoulos. I don't know if there are any Greeks here. I always ask my Greek friends, does it mean blue eyes, or does it mean Gallinopoulos, meaning milk servant? All of us know what milk is in Greek, even if we don't realize it, because of the word galaxy. galaxy is the Milky Way. Zeus is supposed to have ripped a baby from his mother's breast, and the milk was sprayed over the sky. And then in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a string of popularized publications coming out. Atlantis was involved, Marinotis and Marva was involved. And they're the ones that really popularized this idea that Santorini was actually Atlantis. And the geological input over recent years has really been by Friedrich. He wrote this book in 2000, Fire in the Sea, where there was much better geological control on things than some of the previous work. So what's this all about? Where is Thera? Well, it's right in the southern Aegean, in the ocean between the southern Aegean Ocean, just north of Crete, about 80 k's north of Crete. It's in the middle of an area. These are all the different Greek dialects in those days. But this would be the dialect in the south here, the Doric, which is basically the Minoan civilization dialect, and also the Mycenaean, Greek Mycenaean in the south there. Just as a little aside, I took our honor students to this island here, Samothraki, which is called Samothrace. And this is where the Nike, the Wind Victory of Samothrace, was found in 2nd century BC, now sitting in the Louvre Museum. Many of you will recognize that word there, which is either pronounced Nike or Nike these days. And this is the inspiration for the swish. What do you want to call it? The Nike sign, which should be pronounced Nike. So switching from Greek to geology, it's actually quite complex geology in the Aegean, but we can simplify it quite reasonably, I think. All these little red dots here are 40 years of earthquakes in those areas. Black lines are obviously faults. And simplifying the geology, islands in the northern Aegean are not volcanic. The ones in the south are volcanic. Why should this be? The geologists amongst you can probably go for a drink now. This is prepared for some non-geologists to explain what's going on here. The island of Santorini is sitting in an area where there's interplay between 3 plates here. The African plate is being subducted northwards under the Anatolia plate. And so we simply have the subduction dome going down, partial melting, and you've got a volcanic arc in the Aegean Sea. And all these red dots are the volcanic islands in the southern Aegean. Earthquakes getting deeper as you go towards the north. The actual trench here is just south of Crete. So that's the first control of what's going on there. The second one is the Red Sea is opening. The Arabian plate is actually moving to north-northeast along the Dead Sea Rift, of course, an area of earthquakes and movements. This is a Knights Templars fortress, Chastelet, which actually this wall here is offset by a fault running through it. This fort is actually one of my favorite stories about Saladin. I had a career path before I became a geologist, and as was going to Sandhurst, the British Army officer training place. And as part of that, there were lots of interviews and tests and this, that, and the other. And I remember sitting in a very huge hall with all these famous paintings of the Duke of Marlborough, Duke of Wellington, all around the place, and being asked by this very important general, who was my favorite military commander. Could be an emperor, it could be a general, what did a field marshal? And I said Saladin, and the man just looked like a goldfish, gaping away. And I explained why I thought Saladin was simply the best. He was actually an administrator who was forced into becoming a military leader. And when required, he would be ruthless, such as Acre, just beheading all the crusaders in front of the walls. And at other times, he was very magnanimous. When they took over Jerusalem, he released everybody and gave them a safe passage to the sea. Whereas when the crusaders took over Jerusalem, they actually killed everybody, even the Christians. But when they were building, when the Knight Templars were building this fortress, Saladin actually sent somebody down with a bribe to tell them to stop. Said, we'll pay you this money if you stop building. The Templars turned it down. And he did this a number of times. They kept on turning him down. So the day they finished it, he moved in and destroyed it and told them he should have taken the money. Another evidence of these earthquakes and earth movements, if you go to Jerusalem, the walls of Jerusalem were actually built by Suleiman the Magnificent. And you see the Arabic writing up here. And you can see the way in these archways, all of these stones here have little nicks in them, which allows a little bit of jostling and it doesn't drop the stone out. But I've often wondered whether Suleiman the Magnificent really had faith in his engineers. And maybe that's the reason why he walked around with this on his head. So the Arabian plate moving to the north-northeast there is actually causing the Anatolian plate to squeeze out a bit like an orange pit towards the south-southeast, like that. And that direction there is causing some extension like that. And so when you look at Santorini now, there are some string of normal faults in that orientation because of this extension. And the volcanic activity is still active. The Colombo volcano erupted in 1650 here. There's a swarm of dikes there. And then the other volcanic line runs through the caldera throughout like that. So that's the sort of the geological background of why there is this specific island at this specific point with volcanic eruptions. This is a photo from a 1950 eruption of this little Nea Comina inside the caldera. So the eruption which occurred in the Minoan days on Thera had a volcanic explosive index of magnitude about 6 to 7, which doesn't mean a lot to people, but that's basically large. The estimates for times of eruptions are from 6 hours to 4 days. Well, the fact that people managed to get off the island suggests that either there were some pre-major eruption activity that got them to leave, or it's probably the 4-day option where people got out. There's 60 cubic kilometers of rock blasted out during that eruption. It's an ultra-Plinian eruption, so it reached about 30 to 35 kilometers high. That's the estimate. And just to put this into perspective, if you put a diagram of explosiveness that way, an height of eruption column that way, the eruptions on Hawaii are down here. This is the eruption that's taking place on Thera. There's also a bit of a mixture here because there was water involved. So there's some phreatic activity. Most famous one in modern watching it take place was Circe off Island. And then the Plinian eruption of Mount St. Helens is fairly well documented as to what goes on in those eruptions. But probably the most spectacular Plinian eruptions in the modern day are those of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. It's named after Pliny the Younger, where he watched Vesuvius blow its top in AD 79. It's, I say, the eruption column can get up to 55 k's height, and the fallout extends thousands of kilometers from the volcano. It tends to be explosive viscous magma, and things like pyroclastic flows and lahars and debris flows associated with them. And the most famous, probably historically, is the one in Tambora in Indonesia in 1815. That's the one that gave rise to the spectacular sunset around the world for a number of years that so inspired some painters. Krakatoa is famous because it made a big noise that everybody heard. And then Mount St. Helens and Mount Pinatubo more recently are well studied. The really big one in relatively recent times was Toba, 74,000 years ago. That had a VI of 8, and that is considered responsible for almost wiping out all the humans of that day, producing a genetic bottleneck. So some simple diagrams for the non-geologists. if you've got a Plinian eruption, you'll get some little activity beforehand, pre-Plinian pumice and ash. That may have been going on that got the people to shift out of Thera. Then the actual column eruption expands out into a cloud at height. And then the column collapses. And because it's expanded, it can't go back down the hole it came up. And that's when you get the debris flows and pyroclastic flows cascading down the side of the mountain. Some would have been coming out when that blast went up, but a majority of them, the really big ones, are when that column collapses. And then everything basically tries to go down the plug hole again. We've shifted a whole lot of magma out from under a volcano up into the top of it. So that causes caldera collapse, and all the ash that's hanging around in the atmosphere settles back down again. So in the case of Santorini or Thera, we have a caldera which is rimmed, which has been covered by this volcanic ash and the oceans. And if you all remember the photos that come out of the Philippines when this ash comes down, this just spectacular, it's all gray landscape. And that ash, of course, settles down through the sea, and we find it in the cores, in the sediment cores. So this is quite a neat little diagram done by Kirsty Evans in MSc at Hawaii. She wasn't really doing anything about the ruptures, nothing related to it, but summarized it quite nicely. Precursory pumice, then a phase 1 pumice occurring there. So it's burying buildings but not knocking them down. It's really the pyroclastic surge of phase 2 that starts to destroy buildings. And then phase 3, there's another pyroclastic surge. And then there are these debris flows, lahars and ignimbrites in phase 4. So in this diagram, she's just draped over the topography where these are. Phase 1 is about 7 meters thick, covering that part of the island. Phase 2 is 12 meters thick. Phase 3 is where we get the thick deposits. First of the thick deposit, 55 meters thick. And then phase 4, another thick deposit, and debris flows and stuff at 40 meters thick, like that. You'll see that actually just this southeast tip of the island here actually never gets covered during any of these eruption phases. If you're wondering why there's nothing on here, well, they didn't exist then, as we can show here, a series of diagrams here. So when you look at an oblique Google Earth, you can see what looks like snow along the lip of the caldera here. That is actually the Minoan eruption. Very characteristic white color. Got all the older activity down here, but this Minoan one is right at the top there. Phase 1 is that airfall tuff, probably about 8 hours or so. Phase 2 and 3 are pyroclastic base surge flows, top there. Phase 4, we've got these dark colored xenoliths. So these are debris flows taking place. Beautiful structures in there. And Friedrich presents quite a nice little summary of this section here for people to be able to interpret, that he's saying the opening in this massive sequence here, the opening of the vent and eruption of pumice, followed by when water gets in, we're starting to get phreatic eruptions taking place. And then as things widen up, we've got separate basins developing the caldera, and ash and older debris are being injected out into the sequence. So in a series of maps, this is what Thera looked like before the eruption. It had a very nice natural harbor with a little island in the middle. It even had stromatolites, actually, then. In the first part of the eruption, that harbor disappears. So that is when the people probably got out of there as fast as possible when they realized that was going on. And then we have the building up of a new caldera isolated from the sea. So this one here is what we're basically seeing today. And then the caldera actually gets linked to the sea. The old passageway opens through there. And then other ones, subsequent landslides have caused that to occur. And we see what we see today, a post-caldera construction with the new volcanic islands beginning to develop here. And in some nice little 3Ds, that rather thing looking like a bald man in the middle of a lake is that original volcanic edifice. Phases 1, 2, and 3 basically fill up that caldera. Phase 4 is where we start to get the real collapse. We get the debris flows, which are actually going out onto the sea. And these are the phases that probably cause the tidal waves. And then today we see a structure look like this, where that old passageway has opened up and some landslides have opened up this side here. So I mentioned ash going up into the sky and coming down into the sea. So it's possible to measure from the core, seafloor cores, how thick the ash is going around the place. There's clearly a wind coming from the west at that time, putting the ash out there. There's evidence of tsunamis, and pumice is found up to 250 meters above sea level. There's well-documented tsunami hitting Crete. It's been a well-studied one there, and these localities here. So we said this is a Minoan eruption at the time of that civilization, but when exactly did it take place? So this is Thera. Knossos was the capital of the Minoan civilization. The pyramids of Giza in Lower Egypt are here, and Thebes in Upper Egypt here, just to give you a bit of geography lesson. So I'm just going to do a quick summary of Egyptian and Eastern Mediterranean civilizations to work out where this exactly occurred. This is the Bronze Age from this period, 2600 to about 1200 AD. In Egypt, we have the Old Kingdom, where the pyramids of Giza were built at that time. We then have the first intermediate period. That is a time of drought, the 4.2 kilo-year event. Old Egyptian was spoken in those days then. Then after the break, we've got the Middle Kingdom. There's a second intermediate period, which is a time of a little bit of chaos. And then we go into the New Kingdom, and Tutankhamun and Ramesses II, who we saw earlier, are part of that story there. And Middle Egyptian is spoken at that stage. As I mentioned, the hieroglyphics start at about 3500 BC. So there's a written record all the way through here of what was going on. And then around about 1200 BC, there was a drought. The whole of the Mediterranean Ocean went cold, and it also caused a bit of chaos at that stage. This is when the Sea Peoples invaded Egypt. The Sea Peoples are a motley crew who came across from Europe. They are the Philistines of the Old Testament, and they are now the Palestinians. So they were originally the Sea Peoples who came into the Eastern Mediterranean during this time of chaos. This is what the other parts of the Mediterranean looked like at that time. Obviously, the Minoan civilization was found on the Greek islands and across in Crete, so there's a correlation between them. But this is where the really good time scale has been given to us by the studies done in Egypt. In the Minoan civilization, we have linear A writing starting around about between 18 and 1900 BC. So languages has yet to be deciphered. Linear B got deciphered and recognized as an ancient form of Greek. So we have some records here, written records here from the Minoan. We have written records here, but can't read them. This is a papyrus, the Turin papyrus from 1150 BC, which I'm just going to have a little sideshow on. I was told about this papyrus when between my first and second year at university. I spent that long summer vacation undertaking topographic mapping for the Swiss Glacier Commission. And the surveyor in charge was a guy who'd been in the British colonial service all over the place. And knowing that I was a geologist interested in archaeology, he told me about this. And the following year, I was actually doing my honors mapping in the Western Alps. I was there for about 2 months. And my girlfriend rather heroically decided to come out and visit me. I forgot to mention to her it was a 25-kilometer walk into where I was working, but that's by the by. And she had to fly home from Turin. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity to go and see the Turin Papyrus. Unfortunately, the bus schedule was such I couldn't get there, and I've never got back. So why do I want to go and see the Turin Papyrus? It's the world's oldest geological map. It's taken a bit of time for people to agree where this area is. North is actually to the left here, as with old maps. East is towards the top, because you orientate yourself by facing the Orient, the rising sun. And it's been well recognized now that these wadis here can correlate very nicely with known wadis. And I can verify that because actually earlier this year, I was actually mapping in this area. So it came a full circle for me to actually go to the area that the Turin Papyrus existed. It really is a geological map. Okay, it's got information here about mountains with gold, mountains with red gold, or it could be mountains in which gold is washed. But red gold means there's copper in there, and also just off this, there's a mountains with white gold, which is gold with silver. And it's a quite recognizable map. That well in the middle of the map there still exists. These sites exist here. So it is the world's first geological map, produced just at that time when there was a problem at 1250 BC. The decline in Minoan civilization took place actually over a long period. It wasn't a sudden stop, as was suggested by the volcanic eruption. Archaeology and history says that the eruption took place here in the between 1500 and 1600 BC. Geochronology says, nope, it took place between 1600 and 1700 BC. So there's a slight disagreement here, and I'll just give you the dates, where these dates come from. The Minoan eruption is considered to occur at the end of the Second Intermediate Period and the beginning of the New Kingdom, and the evidence for this is the Tempest Stela of Amhos I, which is found in Karnak Temple in Luxor. This is Amhos, and this is the stela, which has been described as the world's oldest weather report. So we've seen the oldest geological map. Now we've got the oldest weather report, and describing really unusual weather conditions. And those are considered to be a result of that Minoan eruption on Thera. And this is dated around about 1550 BC, or 1570, or 1560, or 1539, depending on whose scale you use for Egypt. In geochronology, the beginning of the New Kingdom has been dated between 1570 to 1540 BC, which is that range of dates we've seen below. And the Minoan eruption, these dates have taken place on grain seeds which are preserved just below the eruption. So they were considered as being harvested just prior to the eruption, and also from an olive branch, which is actually inside some of the volcanics. So there's a date there which came out in 2020, quite a nice accurate one, 1617 to 1601 by Manning et al. But more recently, Manning has gone and said, well, no, actually, it may be between 1609 and 1560. Now, this is because of some other work done, which suggests that the international calibration line used for carbon-14 dating may actually be more flexible than is usually considered. There's another way of looking at this, and that is the possibilities through a combination of tree rings and ice cores. And Pearson et al. Have them dates. They say the date could be 1611 BC, 1562 to 1555, or 1538 BC. And in that paper, I mentioned that they have a very nice diagram summarizing all of that. However, I can't show it to you because Oxford University Press wanted me to pay $71 US to show it, even though it's for educational, non-commercial, non-for-profit purpose. So I'll just remind you of those dates. Okay, we've got a range of dates here. Most notably, that's the one, the older one, the old geochronology dates will be 1600 plus. These dates here are sort of intermediate, and these dates here aren't quite as young as the Egyptologists would like. But that seems to be the range of dates. So is there any connection between the legend and the fact? Because Atlantis was supposed to be out in the Atlantic Ocean and 9,500 years BC. In this case, it's nowhere near that. Well, there is one. The Thera prior to the eruption was of a similar shape and dimension to the city of Metropolis in Atlantis. And we know the eruptions I've just mentioned could occur at any of those dates. You can play around with what you want these days, choose an age. But the important thing is all these dates here are well before the end of the Minoan civilization. So that Thera eruption did not wipe out the Minoan civilization. It just wiped out Thera. For Thera to be Atlantis, there has to be a tenfold exaggeration in the legend. 9,000 years has to become 900 years ago. There has to be a mistake between the Greek words meson and meson, which means that greater than Libya and Asia becomes between Libya and Asia. That's an easy mistake to make, quite obviously. And there's an issue here about beyond the pillars of Heracles. So either it was misunderstood what the Pillar of Hercules was, or is misunderstood now, because the Pillars of Heracles now is considered to be the Straits of Gibraltar, or it was incorrectly used. And maybe it was incorrectly used to be misleading, and that's the fake Paleonews. So that's my story on Atlantis. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Mike. That was excellent. So it doesn't exist.
It exists in some people's minds. I mean, some people have lived there, and they've also lived in Canis Major.
Well, fantastic. Anyway, I see Lou's already got his hand up. Go for it, Lou. Get the discussion going. You want to download?
Okay. Mike, what an articulate and entertaining talk. I am very impressed. So thanks, man.
Thanks, Lou.
Okay. Regarding Atlantis, I wanted to share with you a story that you probably already know. But some years ago, when my friends and I were publishing papers about our discovery of a little piece of continental crust where it shouldn't be, and that is under the volcano in Mauritius. The press had a field day with this. I tell you, I must have done 50 interviews with everybody in the world, and there's even an article in Cosmopolitan magazine with my name in it. I still can't believe it. I mean, who would think years ago that my name would one day appear in the pages of Cosmopolitan? But you know what the press did with this was they started calling this the lost continent. And of course, that led everyone to believe that I had discovered Atlantis. And I started getting all of these emails from all over the world saying, tell me more about Atlantis, you know, and then I had to sort of tell them the truth that it had nothing to do with Atlantis in the Indian Ocean. in addition to that, I started getting emails from guys in India who pointed out to me that in the Bhagavad Gita or some damn book that was written a million years ago in India, they discussed a piece of continent where people were living on it in the Indian Ocean. They had a different name for it than Atlantis, but they started saying, well, who the hell are you to start getting famous about this when we published it thousands of years ago, So I just thought I would share that with you regarding Atlantis. And thanks again for a terrific talk.
Thanks, Lou.
Were you modeling for Cosmopolitan as well?
Yes, I did model, and I can show you the picture of it. It looks very similar.
No,
to,
Lou, save me, please. I don't want to see it.
Okay, do you want to unshare, Mike, so we can see you again? You can now see if your hair
can't
got
see me, if you remember. Can't get on camera.
You can't still. Okay.
No.
Right.
Has to be just.
Is it still missing then?
Yeah, I don't know where my camera's gone to here.
Okay, or perhaps just
But basically, it's in camera instead of on camera.
Yeah, I don't know what. I mean, I gave a talk the other day. The camera's fine. I saying I haven't got a camera. It's ridiculous. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, a great talk, Mike, and lots of food for thought, and just shows again the importance of good geology and how those old timers didn't really miss much. But I guess when you then go and look at the Indus Basin civilization and that development, it almost parallels what you've just talked about, Mike. I don't know if you've looked at any of that stuff. Further to the east, and I guess back then with the big land bridges and lack of ability to travel, there wouldn't have been much interaction between what you've just described in the west, effectively, and what was going on in sort of northern parts of India.
No, there was trade. I mean, if I mentioned right at the beginning about when Egypt in the north, Agrippa got there, down in the south around Thebes, the Nagda culture there. Now by 4,300 BC, these guys were trading all over the place. I mean, there was pottery coming in from Syria and Palestine, and there were trade routes going all over the place. But very quickly after the Neolithic Revolution, people were connecting.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, Mike, you're an amazing storyteller. That I believe that that motto says, "Do not let the truth necessarily stand in the way of a very good story." You do it so well that in the beginning I'm doubting everything you say. Then eventually I say, well, which of what is now saying is actually true and which is not? Because the mingling of your spices is so immaculate that one cannot find, where you are going from fiction to fact.
It's just like my science, isn't it, Steve?
Right. Steve Haggerty.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. That was a fantastic talk, and I agree with Lou on that. Absolutely wonderful. I was surprised that you didn't mention anything about the Bermuda Triangle, and living in Miami, which is one of the coordinates to it, is that it's thought also that the remnants of the hypothetical or mythical Atlantis right in the middle of the triangle. And just to remind you, the triangle goes from Bermuda to Miami and then to Puerto Rico. Any comments on that, Mike?
Well, if I had time, I could have taken you for a journey around the world, all the places which they claim that Atlantis is. But the Bermuda Triangle is supposed to be, isn't it, because of methane released from a sea floor that ships disappear very quickly.
Correct.
And they get a bubble of that underneath and they sink quite quickly.
Right.
But yeah, it's you name the place and people have claimed Atlantis was there. It's just quite remarkable.
Okay.
Go to Gaia.com, you'll learn an awful lot there.
Yes.
If you've got nothing better to do.
Thanks again, Mike.
Anyone else? I think you've kind of dazzled people, Mike. But I mean, it does go a step further, you know. And obviously, you were a bit tongue in cheek too. But you know, when you look at this whole climate change story, and you know, we all know, particularly those of us sitting down here in the Southern Cape, that you know, climate change has happened regularly, and sea levels have gone up and down. You know, how do you get the politicians, you know, educated in this respect as well? And, you know, I found that article, you know, that quoted you after your presentation. When was it? Earlier this year or last year?
Yeah.
You know, that was very interesting all round, and I'll circulate it in our next newsletter for interest.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that change from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom, that first intermediate period, it was quite remarkable how late people thought, actually, no, this is actually something environmental. I mean, I remember when I was at university that the social anthropologists were always going on about social reasons why these things were occurring. And you just simply said, well, there was no water. I mean, take water away and people are in a dire strait. That's when you get upheaval. So they had about a century of no water. And so that 4.2 kiloyear event affects basically the Fertile Crescent and across into the Indian and Chinese civilization at that time.
Yeah.
Seems to have very little effect if you go into Northern Europe and even in Africa, but across that belt, it was a really important event. And then the 1200 BC one, which was the cooling of the Mediterranean, that tends to be quite a local thing. But, you know, it caused disruptions. People have to start moving to find resources.
And of course now with an overpopulated world, you don't have that flexibility.
You can't move around their borders. Well, people are moving around. They're trying to move into Europe and Britain to get to places. But you know, the environmental changes are really driving a lot of these civilizations, collapses and picking up.
Yeah. And if only the politicians would come and talk to us, come and visit the Barnes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Mike, a friend of mine has started a society called SOM, Save Our Moon Society. You know, they're now going to exploit over there. Maybe we're going to recruit you as one of the new founding members there.
No, I'll probably change my mind next week.
Okay. Any other questions, discussions? Clyde Mallison.
Clyde will just do an inventory on it.
Yeah, just checking. It is next week when I'm meant to be speaking. Is that correct? I tend to mix up my Thursdays.
I'll check for you now. Yeah, it says Clyde Mallison, 10th of November. Is that correct? At 11.
There we go. All right.
Can you send us some pictures, please, to promote this?
I'm sure I can think of something. Mike, can I steal some of your pictures?
Yeah, $71 US a time, Clyde.
Oh, okay, there we go.
No.
And going back to Bruce Williamson's question a bit earlier, you're going to, you know, cover some of this legislation or supposed legislation that's sort of gone round and round in this country. Clyde, you're going to give us a bit of an overview as well.
And basically, what I'm doing in this next week is I'm homing in on the present. My previous talk was looking at the future to a certain extent. So I'll be winding back onto the present, and I'm actually proposing a solution where the Western Cape can take a lead in sorting out the solution for the whole country, for itself, but as a byproduct for the whole country. So it's kind of like a copper moly mine, if you like. It'll mine the copper for itself, and it'll have moly as a byproduct for the rest of the country, as a really poor analogy, but you get the point.
Okay. All right, we look forward to it. Any last comments?
So I need 1 million well-heeled West Cape Tonians
To do what?
to do what needs to be done.
Put up $1 million each.
No, not that much. Not that much.
Yeah. Well,
Cool.
down here we keep on getting told, that we're going to have freewheeling, and we'll buy your solar and all of those good things. Then we get threatened with fines when we've got solar and we're ready to push back into the grid. So I think there's also a problem, as you'll know, in politics, Clive, that left hand doesn't really know what the right hand does.
Yeah, the only freewheeling I'm familiar with is going downhill on a bicycle, but that's another story.
Cool. Okay, thanks everyone. Henny, have you got any more housekeeping?
No, it's just to remind you guys, the very person who spoke now, Clyde, will be talking to us on clean energy next week. See you at 11.
Thanks, Mike. That was a great talk, and it will be on YouTube shortly.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, tremendous stuff.